Well, I want to thank All Souls Church for inviting me, for all of you for coming. It's amazing to me that you could tear yourself away from the State of the Union message that the President... Yes, you may still get out in time. It's possible. The President will give his campaign speech this evening, and the Republicans will follow with theirs. It's very good for President Obama to be followed by Republicans. He looks so good. And when he isn't followed, not so good, as I'll try to explain to you. I often begin, and I'm going to do it this evening as well, by asking a favor of you all, which is to remember that many of the things I'm about to go through with you as we talk about the costs of this economic crisis and who has been and will be paying them, I want you to please remember that I'm just the messenger. If what I say distresses you, then I've gotten my point across. But if you get angry at me, I will feel bad. So I would like to ask you, please, to remember that I'm just explaining as best I can. Because what our president and what the other party say are now, if they were ever otherwise, campaign speeches, I am proudly going to assert that I think I can do a job of explaining what's been going on since I'm not running for anything, without having to sugarcoat what the reality is. So bear with me as I use my training in economics over a lifetime of teaching this. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, to try to give you a whirlwind tour through what you've been experiencing, but perhaps to put it together in a clearer way than has been the case before. Okay, so the costs of the crisis, that's what we're going to talk about. What have they been? What are they now? Was there an alternative? Is there an alternative to the way this has been handled? And what might that look like? Let's begin with the costs of the period leading up to the crisis, but even before it hit. By the way, this crisis hit officially. There's an agency in the US government called the National Bureau of Economic Research, and that's the agency that actually declares when recessions start and end and things like that. And according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, this crisis begins in December of 2007. Therefore, we are now in the fifth year of this economic downturn, and there is no end in sight. There are presidents and others who promise you we've turned the corner. A year ago in the State of the Union speech, President Obama said we had broken the back of the economic downturn. That proved to be as premature as all the other statements made by President Bush and others who had promised it wouldn't happen, or it wouldn't be bad, or it wouldn't last a long time. None of that turned out to be the case. So we are in a very serious economic downturn. It is the second major breakdown of our capitalist economic system in 75 years. The last one was the 1930s. We're not that bad yet. We don't know yet what will happen. Between the end of the Great Depression, usually measured around 1939-40, and the beginning of this crisis, December 2007, the National Bureau of Economic Research counts 11 other economic downturns. 2 major catastrophes, and between them 11 downturns, during which those 11, millions of people lost their jobs, millions of people's lives were interrupted, and so on. An economic system that collapses in a major way twice in 75 years, and that has serious downturns. And those of us in New York should remember that in 1974 and 75, we had a doozy here in the United States, and in New York particularly. That's an extraordinarily unstable economic system. I used to tell my students, if you lived with a person as unstable as this economic system, you would long ago have either moved out or insisted that he or she get professional help. But most of us live with this economic system as if there were no alternative. So let's go and take a look at how it grew. To do this, we have to do a little bit of history, but it's worth it. The United States is a very remarkable place. For 150 years, from shortly after the beginning of our existence as a nation, roughly 1820, 1830, a few years after our independence, to 1970, for about 150 years, the United States was a place where the wages went up, decade after decade. It's kind of amazing. 150 years, and I don't mean the wages, just the money you get, but the money adjusted for the prices you pay. So it's a real measure. It's called the real wage in economics, a measure of how much stuff people got for an average hour of work. It rose for 150 years. There's probably no other capitalist economy that was able to deliver that record to its people. It helps to explain why so many people came here as immigrants, because they calculated that their shot was better at a good life here than where they came from, and they were right. And it produced here in the United States a remarkable mentality, understandable. People began to believe they lived in a really charmed place. Wow. The world has somehow organized to make something happen here that doesn't happen anywhere else. Decade after decade. And so Americans began to believe that every generation lives better than the one before, your kids will do better than you, your grandkids still better than them, that it's somehow built in. Go to school, learn, work hard, and you will arrive. And that's an understandable interpretation. Why was that true? Why did the wages go up if it didn't anywhere else? What was it that was unique about the United States? And I don't want to burst anyone's bubble here, but the explanation in economics is really pretty simple. We call it in economics a labor shortage. See, the Europeans who came here, and there's no polite way to say this, did away with the people who they found. And even if they hadn't, it's not clear that those local folks, the Native Americans, would ever have worked for them. But they did away with them, took the land, and discovered quickly that the land is very fertile, the sea coasts are very navigable, it's a good place to do business. And business was done, and business was good. Profits were earned. But every time a business tried to grow with its profits, there was no one to work. There weren't enough people. And so in order to solve the problem, you had to bring people here. White people were brought here by inducing them to come. Black people had no choice. But for the white people, the way to bring them was by offering higher wages than they could get where they had been, so that the relatives who came first could tell those left behind, it's true, you do get better wages. And then there was a problem they discovered, that it wasn't enough to pay higher wages to bring people here. Because all the land had been taken away from the Native Americans, you had to keep raising their wages, because if you didn't, in New York or Philadelphia or Boston, they would just get up and leave and go west and get a farm. They had all been farmers anyway. So you had to raise the wages to bring them, and then you had to raise the wages to keep them. Not a complex story. That's why wave after wave of immigrants had to be brought here. We were always in a labor shortage. Then in the 1970s, again, no mystery. There's no mystery here. For those of you that are wondering, there is a question, which is if what the story I'm telling you is one you hadn't heard before, you ought to wonder why that is. But there's no mystery here. In the 1970s, the labor shortage stopped. And it never resumed. And the reasons are not hard to find. Number one, the American business community discovered the joy of the computer. You could replace an awful lot of people with a computer. Before the 1970s, when you went to a supermarket and you took a box of cereal from here and a can of soda from there and a pound of coffee from there, there had to be people who kept track of all of that and ran in the back and got more to replace what you had purchased and taken home. Huge numbers of people. Now, one college student sitting in front of a computer in Boise, Idaho, can keep track of exactly how many rolls of toilet paper have been removed from a supermarket in Brooklyn. And you don't need anyone in the store in Brooklyn. He hits a button that orders the replacement box of the rolls for the time you need them to take care. Wow. Thousands of people's jobs gone. So the first thing that happens, it's really interesting in the 1970s, is that the demand for labor goes down because the computer wipes out huge numbers of jobs. Number two, American businesses reacted to 150 years of rising wages that they had had to pay. And one of their reactions, they left the United States and went looking to hire cheaper workers someplace else. And what began as a trickle became a stream, and then, to this day, a flood. That's why every one of you, unless you're very unusual, is wearing an item of clothing, and maybe several, right now, not made here. Not made here. Companies left. Well, between the people who lost their job because they were replaced by a computer, and the people who lost their job because they were replaced by a worker in another country whose wages hadn't been going up because they didn't have a labor shortage. For example, China has a labor surplus, the opposite. The demand for workers, the demand for jobs fell down. But that's not the end of the story. At the same time in the 1970s that the demand for jobs went down, the number of people looking for jobs shot up. Two groups entered the labor market in huge numbers. First, and by far the most important, adult American women moved in a massive way because of social changes, because of the women's liberation movement, because of all kinds of things, into a new self-definition. They wanted a job out of the home, alongside the husband, earn their own money, become their own person, no longer be defined simply as homemaker, mother, housewife. Take on another job, paid labor. Millions of them began to move into the labor market. And we had a whole new wave of immigration, where before the immigration had mostly come from Europe. Starting in the 70s, the major immigration was from Latin America. Huge new groups of people entering the country, huge new groups of women entering the labor force. The combination of fewer jobs because of computers and factories leaving, and more people looking, created what? The opportunity for every employer to look at his or her workers and say, I don't have to raise wages anymore. And as they will teach you in every business school in America, If you're an employer and you don't have to raise wages, don't do it. And the employers understood. And the wages stopped rising. Here's a central statistic, perhaps the most important one I can talk to you about this evening, to remember. The wages of Americans in the 1970s stopped rising. That is, what you get adjusted for the prices you pay is the same today in 2012 that it was in 1978. No increase in real wages. Flat. Now, if I had time, and I don't, I could tell you what it must have been like in many people's minds, including yours, to be part of a country that for 150 years had come to believe something was in the cards for them. Something was built into this society. Your chance to work, your chance to do better, your chance, your chance, your chance. What happens to such a culture, ours, if it's over? It stops. Well, if I were a psychologist, I would say that causes a trauma. And the trauma is worse, as is the case with all traumas in life, if you can't talk about it, if there's no one to discuss it with, no one to commiserate with you about it. And as a nation, we didn't recognize it, we didn't talk about it, and not a single president to this date has ever gone to the American people to talk about it. So the American people tried to handle it individually. And if some of this is beginning to sound like it's a little bit the story of you and your family, good, it should. Because I really am talking about you and me. It's always a very sad thing when human beings try to solve a social problem with an individual decision. You're going to solve a social problem, you need a social movement. But Americans didn't build a social movement around this issue because they didn't see it. It wasn't discussed. So Americans did two individual things over the last 30 years. And now we're going to begin the count of the costs of this crisis and of our economy. The first thing individuals did, if you don't get more real wage per hour of labor, do more hours. And Americans began, if they had a job, take a second one. If you have a part-time job, get a full-time job. If you're a teenager, do something on the afternoon and the weekends. And if you're a retired person, come back out of retirement. If you're a family whose emotional life has been held together by the mother, give up your emotional life because mama has to go out to work. 30 years ago, if you turned on the television, what you saw was the celebration of a stylized family. Father gets up, puts on a shirt and tie, and goes to work. Mom stays home, takes care of Dick and Jane and the little dog Spot, and has everything ready for the dinner when the hubby comes home. Today you turn on the television and the family you see is a fundamentally dysfunctional collection of people who don't like each other. The husband and wife barely cohabit and make cracks about each other's performance. The children are alienated from the parents. You know the scene. We laugh at what has happened to us because the alternative, as you know, is to cry. And we're afraid to do that. So the first reaction of the American people was to work more and more. Here's a little statistic for you that I like to tell my audiences. According to the OECD, one of the major international statistical agencies, American working people do more hours of paid labor than the working class of any other country on the face of the earth, including Japan, which is often put forward as the place where people do the longest hours. We beat them. The costs of this to our health, to our mental health, to our interpersonal relationships, to our sense of exhaustion and irritation with one another, is stupendous. If I had time, I'd go through it with you. We are 5% of the world's population. We consume 65% of the world's psychotropic drugs. Prozac, antidepressants, all of it. Now, either you explain that by saying that the United States is a population of drug addicts, or if you reject that because it really is silly, then you have to look at what might make a perfectly reasonable population, which I think we are, function this way. Well, I think I've given you a clue. We work ourselves literally to death. And the second thing the American working class did to cope with the end of rising wages, a population that wanted to experience the American dream, to have a nice home, to have a nice car, to go on a nice vacation, and to give your children a nice education. How are you going to do that? You're a parent who really has promised it in 1,000 ways to your children. You want to deliver it. The fact that your wages will no longer make that affordable is impossible. And since there's no social discussion of it, you don't see it as a social phenomenon the way I've just explained it. You begin to internalize it and imagine it's your personal fault. You don't work hard enough. You didn't go to school long enough. You didn't take the right courses. You didn't major in the right topic. It's you. So Americans decided that's unbearable psychologically. So if I'm not going to earn the money to enjoy the American dream, even if I work more, then there's only one thing left for me to do. And starting in the 1970s, the American people did it. They went on the biggest consumer borrowing binge that the world had ever seen. In the 1970s, the United States invented a mechanism to pump credit into everybody's wallet. You're now carrying it. It's called a credit card. Before that, it only existed for wealthy travelers, the American Express card. After that, we have Visa, MasterCard, the stuff that's in your wallets, lots of it, so that you can buy everything, including a can of soda, bag of potato chips. You can go through the toll booth on the highway and stick the card in there. You can borrow for everything. And so for 30 years, the American people postponed their appointment with the end of the labor shortage and the end of rising wages. They stalled it off by working themselves to death, by undergoing psychological trauma as the mother who held the family together is too tired, and the family can't quite solve the problem any other way because they're all working too hard. And then by the end, the anxiety of debt levels they could not sustain. So by 2007, it collapsed. But here, think of the costs. The debt and the agony of the debt. The overwork and the agony of the overwork. The self-blame that all of this was your own fault. The psychological, physical toll on the American people. Of course we take drugs like crazy people. So the costs of this crisis already happen in the process leading up to it. Did everybody suffer? No. The people who didn't suffer from this arrangement have a name. They're called employers, as opposed to employees. And let's see quickly why. During the last 30 years that the wages were flat, the productivity of labor, it's an idea that economists love to talk about. Productivity simply means how much stuff on average, in an hour, does an employee produce? How many hamburgers per hour if you're a McDonald's flipper? How many software programs if you work in Silicon Valley? How much stuff per hour can you produce? Well, over the last 30 years, that kept going up. Workers were better trained. They had better and more equipment. That computer I mentioned to you before. One person can do a lot more, year after year. So what we as workers gave to our employers kept going up nicely in the last 30 years, as it had before. We became more productive. Okay, now just put these two things together. You do not need a PhD in economics. I mean, I have that. I didn't bring it with me, but I have it. But you can put these two together without any PhD or MA or BA or any of it. All of you are more than smart enough to figure out what I'm about to tell you. If the wages are flat for 30 years, it means what the employer gives to the employee is flat, because that's what a wage is. If the productivity rises for 30 years, it means that what the worker gives the employer per hour of his or her work keeps going up. So let's do that again. What the employer gives the employee is flat for 30 years. What the employee produces for his or her employer goes up. Of course, we've had 30 years of the greatest peacetime boom in the world. Fantastic. 30 years of no increase in wages while the working class produces more and more. Of course the stock market went nuts. Employers everywhere, not just on Wall Street, on Main Street too, were having the time of their lives, making money like there was no tomorrow. But they didn't understand it any more than the working class did, that it's simply the story of the wages, which it is, no mystery. So the employers began very creatively to invent other stories, different stories. You know how I told you the working class blamed themselves? I didn't work hard enough, I didn't go to the right school. The employers had a completely different story. The one I like most is this one. We're making suddenly so much money here in the 70s and even more in the 80s, and things went really crazy in the 90s. And you know why that is? It's because we top executives are entrepreneurial geniuses. Names like Lee Iacocca or Jack Welch became icons in our culture. The great genius. I always loved this idea because if they were really smart in the 80s and made a lot of money, what were they, morons 10 years earlier? Did some magical transformation happen to them? No. They made that stuff up. I was about to say they wrote these books, but if you ever look at the books, you'll know they didn't write those books because they couldn't. They got ghostwriters to write those books for them. But there was a method to the madness, because if the reason the company is making all this money is because the top executives are suddenly geniuses, well then nothing would seem more reasonable than to pay them accordingly. And so starting in the 1970s, the salary of the top executives of our company go off the charts. From being 30 times or 40 times what the average worker gets, they're now around 350 times. Poor Mitt Romney. He had to reveal last night that over the last couple years, he earned over $40 million as a result of his executive work. Whoa. No salary, no wage. Just that. And in case you missed it, his average pay percentage that they got out of him was in the neighborhood of 15%, which is a lot less than most of you in this room pay for what you earn. But the big executives have been doing that in case you want to get angry at Mr. Romney. Or a couple years ago, Americans got angry at the heads of Goldman Sachs and folks like that. I'm glad that you're angry. You're just 35 years late in your anger, because it's been going on a long time. It isn't surprising that the corporate leaders who made a ton of money over the last 30 years did what they always do when they have a profit boom like this. They got kind of crazy. They began to have a special group of people who simply managed these enormous pools of money that they were collecting. You know the names of these little institutions that began to specialize in managing the money of extraordinarily rich executives. This new entity was called a hedge fund. And that's what it does. And the hedge funds began to outdo each other, competing for the money of these suddenly billionaire folks. People like Mitt Romney, people like Michael Bloomberg, and so on. I'm trying to take them from both parties equally. I know Bloomberg is a Republican, but for most Republicans, he's a Democrat. It's messy. Okay. So what happened? The hedge fund had to compete for the money of the rich, so they had to take riskier and riskier investments. They began to invest, and they hit upon a fantastic way to use all of this money. When I said to you a few minutes ago that American working people started borrowing, I hope in the back of your mind a question was forming. Who did they borrow from? And I'm going to give you the answer now, and when I do, you'll understand the genius of the American capitalist system. The mass of the American people borrowed money from the executives who had made a pile because they didn't have to pay those people rising wages anymore. The same people who would have had to pay rising wages if the 150-year history had continued no longer paid rising wages. Instead, they lent the workers the money. Now ask yourself, if you were in a business school class and you were a prospective employer, what would you rather do? Pay your workers money or lend them money that they have to give back to you, and while you're waiting for it, it accrues interest that they owe you? If I had time, I would stop now and play the national anthem. And you would enjoy it until you understood that the joke was on you. And they began to speculate. Well, if I had more time, I don't. By 2007, two things happened together. The mass exhaustion of the working class. We can't work more hours. We already work more than any other people on earth. And we can't borrow any more money because we can't handle the debts we have. Think of it. For 30 years, the debts go up, but the wages that ultimately will have to pay for them don't. You don't need an advanced degree to understand that can only go so far, and then you'll have a level of debt you simply can't carry. We're there, folks. We've been there for 5 years. The mass of people can't work more to get more money. They can't borrow more to get more money. So they're not going to be the engine of growth in this society the way they had been. And the rich at the top, having lent more money than they should have to the mass of people who couldn't pay it back because those same people weren't paying them wages, they're now lost their money. The system collapsed in 2007. And I mean collapsed. We're in the 5th year because this isn't one of your ups and downs of the capitalist business cycle. This is the result of 30 years It runs deep. It's part of the foundation. Comes out of even longer history before, which is why I bother you a little bit about it. So when it collapsed, everybody who began to look at it realized, uh-oh, this is a big one. This is a bad one. Now, it couldn't be said by the political leaders. Mr. Bush did not want to lose for the Republican Party the presidency. The last thing on earth he wanted was such a thing. Obama swept into office by pointing the finger at Bush, and everybody who was terrified by the crisis voted for Obama. The Republicans are trying to run the same game on Obama now. Just reverse the polarity. The government correctly panicked. And you all live in the city where the panic was most palpable, because this is the center of the capitalist system in the United States and in many ways of the world. So the panic was here. The big moments of panic, the collapse of Lehman Brothers Bank, and many other, but that was the key time. Suddenly, nobody trusted anybody in the world of business, because all the banks and all the insurance companies had gambled and speculated in these loans to people. Loans for your home, loans for your car, loans for your credit card, loans for your student to go to college. For those of you that are interested, these things were all called asset-backed securities. You could buy stocks in something that was simply other people's debts. It took off as a financial gambit invented by 3 lawyers in New York City, that kind of security. The world made money not by buying shares of companies that make things, but by buying shares that gave you a piece of the debts people had, so you would get a piece of the interest they paid on it and the repayment of it. Many of you have mortgages and you pay every month to a bank. But that bank is not the person who owns your mortgage. They just are the servicer. They just do the work of collecting it. It is owned by whoever bought the security, the asset-backed security. Foreign governments, people abroad, banks around the world, and so on. It all fell apart. And when it fell apart, no bank would lend to any other bank. And the reason was simple. Each bank knew that every other bank had invested in these securities and that the mass of people couldn't pay those bills back. They couldn't pay off their cars or their student loans or their mortgage loans. So that these securities were worthless since they depended on people's ability to pay back. So no bank would lend to any other because there was the risk that even if you lent to them overnight, that's a big business in banking, the next morning the bank would call you up and say, no, can't do it, sorry. And you'd be out $10 billion. So all credit stopped. And if you're interested when this happened, September 2008, it stopped. Well, in an economy like ours where everything depends on credit, remember the bag of potato chips you need, credit, your credit card, you can't run our kind of capitalism without credit. So the government panicked. And then the next thing happened that's really big. In that panic, which begins when George Bush is still president, last few months of his presidency, the autumn that Obama gets elected in, the government of the United States, George Bush, with the complete complicity and approval of the Democratic Party as well, starts throwing unbelievable amounts of money at all the largest banks. Why? Because all the largest banks, Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, all of them were defunct. They were bankrupt. They were dead. If they had honestly said what they were, they would have issued a statement to all of you saying, thank you very much for your confidence over the years. We really appreciate the deposits you put here. You'll never see that money again. But they couldn't say that because Americans, being what we are, would have done things to those beautiful bank buildings that you don't even want to think about. So they didn't. but they had no money. Their investments were gone. They couldn't pay back the people who had lent to the banks, and they couldn't pay you, the depositor, either. Kaput, finished. So the government came in and bailed them out. The amount of money in the trillions with a T poured on them. No questions asked. No long congressional debates. Should we do this? No. This was important. Not like a national health insurance program that needs lots of discussion. No discussion. Whoop. How much do you want? Good. Here's that and a little more just to make it go better. Huge amount of money. The government had to, of course, get the money. There are 3 ways to get money for the government. Only 3, ever. Number 1, they could have taxed people. Try to imagine Mr. Bush or Mr. Obama getting on the TV and saying, we have a terrible crisis given what has happened in America, and so we're going to try to fix it, and each of you is going to be taxed an extra 5 or 10 grand each year from now on to pay for it. Ooh. You wouldn't want to be the president who did that. So the solution of the presidents was not to do that. No taxes. Isn't that wonderful? Okay. Number 2 way you can do this. The government can print money. Government needs money to do things? Okay. They're the ones who with the printing presses. If you try to make money, they arrest you, you go to jail. If you're the government, it can make money because who's going to arrest them? And that's the way the law in this country works. A Federal Reserve can print money. And they have been doing that. Lots of it. But they limit that because that's scary. If you keep pumping money into the system, then the great danger will be people who are accumulating more and more money may one day get the idea to, heaven help us, spend it. Then there'll be all this money running after the goods and services, and they will compete with one another, the people with the money and the banks and the companies, and they'll drive up the prices. When you print a lot of money, there's the risk of an inflation. Just think, we might then have not only a crisis of massive unemployment, but an inflation on top of it. Not a good idea. So you print money, it helps, but it's not the only way. Well, what's left? The third and only other way. The government borrows it. Starting in 2008, over the last 4 or 5 years, the government of the United States and the government of most other capitalist countries went on a borrowing binge. Sound familiar? The follow-up to a workers' borrowing binge has been a government borrowing binge to deal with the disaster caused by the workers' borrowing binge. Does it sound to you like maybe it's not the best idea if a working class borrowing binge produces a crisis to solve it by plunging the government into great debt? If that occurred to you, good, you would get an A, at least in my course. But that's what we did. That's what we did. And then the obvious happened. The governments began to look like they weren't such good borrowers. Because it's one thing when the government you're lending to has borrowed a bunch of money, but not that much. But suppose you saw the government suddenly borrowing vast amounts of money, that their debts were growing much faster than their income as a government, you would say about the government exactly what you were saying about people. Their ability to repay is not keeping pace with their debts. So now the lenders began to say to the governments, we don't want to lend to you so much anymore because you don't look good to us. And of course, the lenders did it first with the governments that were the shakiest, the little governments, the governments who weren't a good bet. You wouldn't mind lending to the United States in 2009 and 2010. That's, after all, the biggest, most powerful economy in the world still. But you wouldn't lend anymore to, say, oh, I don't know, Greece, a nice, poor little country. And what is in the minds of the lenders to governments, who are mostly banks, by the way? What's in their mind? Are they worried that those politicians are not going to pay them back? No, they own them. The fear of the lender is not that the leaders won't pay it back, but that you won't permit it. Think what it means if a government is accumulating debt. It has to take more and more of its money to pay the interest on that debt. And where is the government in any country? Ours, Greece, anyone. Where's it going to get the money to carry the rising debt? They're either going to have to go to their people and say, we borrowed to give the trillions to the banks to get out of the mess they made. And so we borrowed, and of course we have to pay a lot of interest, and we have to pay the money back. So we're really sorry, but you're going to have to pay a lot more in taxes. At that point, they get into trouble. Greece's ministers can't go out at night to the theater in Athens because people spit at them. We don't have that here yet. So politicians confronted, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to raise my people's taxes. People went wild. We've just come off in this country 30 years of stress and strain about our debts, 30 years of our wages not going up, 30 years of being exhausted. Now there's a crisis we hardly understood, let alone caused, and we're being told we have to pay high taxes because of how they bailed out the people who screwed us in the first place? It doesn't sound good. So politicians in most places didn't raise taxes. Well, then where are they going to get the money to pay off those debts? Answer: cut the government. Take money that used to be used for everything else and use it instead to pay off the costs of the debt you incurred to bail out the banks. In Europe, this is called by a name that suits this. It's called austerity. It's when the government closes a clinic, shrinks the money for schools, avoids maintaining the roads, lays off the teachers. You know the drill. And uses the money saved to pay the lenders. In little countries like Greece, it has an added twist, since most of the lenders to their government are foreign banks. In Greece's case, German and French banks. So the Greek people have a government, by the way, a government of the Socialist Party of Greece, Papandreou, until recently, when all of what I'm describing to you bounced him out. But until then, this socialist prime minister had to stick it to the Greek people. I have a student, a woman who teaches in an Athens university. Her pay, she's a full professor with tenure, her pay today is 40% less than it was in May 2010 when the cuts began in Greece. 40%. And why? Because she's a public servant. The universities are public institutions. Everybody was cut. Police were cut, fire cut, teachers were cut, garbage collectors, everybody. A lot of people in Greece work for the government. It's a very important sector of their economy. But I want you to understand exactly the same is going on here. We are a country that has a hard time calling things by their proper name. We don't use words like austerity. We refer to something much easier to digest: fiscal conservative. Sounds like something you take when your stomach hurts. It's the same gambit. For example, over the last year, the amount of money used for paying public higher education in the United States is 7% less than what was allocated last year. We're cutting schools at every level: elementary school, secondary school, college, university, everywhere. As an economist, I find this an amazing kind of fact. We teach, all of us in economics, that the future of the United States in a world economy depends more than on anything else on the quality and the quantity of the labor force we are producing. Well, if that's true, here's something to keep in mind. Right now in the United States, roughly 15 million people go to colleges and universities. Under 3 million of them go to private schools. Over 12 million go to public schools. Public higher education is what creates our labor force. Public higher education is what we are savagely cutting. What kind of a society, to deal with an economic downturn, shoots itself in the foot in terms of its long-term economic hopes? You either have to think people are nuts, or you realize they're in a bind where kind of anything they try to do only makes matters worse. So what are the costs of the crisis? The austerity. The people who are not getting the kind of education they need, and they need now more than ever. Welfare cutbacks for people who are desperate. Everywhere, at every level, cutback, cutback, cutback. What kind of an economic system not only plunges the mass of its people into the kind of crisis I've been describing, but just when it does so, just when they need more help, announces to them that the government is going to provide them not with the extra help they need, but with less. That's not a very intelligent arrangement. You kind of ought to have the government help you more when the economic system isn't doing well, not less. Not less. So we are now adding 3 costs. 1, the cost of the 30 years that built up to produce the crisis. 2, the cost of the spectacle of the breakdown of everything, while the people at the top are making a fortune. And now number 3, bearing the costs of austerity, cutbacks in social programs and government employees, just when we need the opposite. That's too much. It's way too much. This morning, the billionaire George Soros issued a statement before he leaves for Davos, Switzerland, where there's a big meeting, as there is every year, of corporate leaders. And he was asked what he fears. And his answer today, this morning, was, "I fear blood, violence, and riots in the streets of America. This cannot go on." Whoa, whoa. You even have the spectacle now of the richest people on earth, like Warren Buffett, saying, stop. This is a train racing into a stone wall. You cannot impose on the mass of people this set of costs, getting worse and worse and worse, while a tiny part of your population lives at a level of wealth that deserves the name obscene. Of course, sooner or later, we would have had to have what we've had over the last 3 or 4 months. A political movement arising in the United States, the Occupy movement, that basically says, this is a story of 99% against 1%. And that's simply recording in a simple slogan, a brilliant slogan, but a simple slogan, the bottom line of everything I've just been telling you about the last 30 or 40 years. When they're accused of fomenting class war by saying that, the only answer is they're just calling it out for what it is. The class war is what's been going on for 30 or 40 years, which we were not allowed to call by its proper name. Let me turn then, as I try to conclude, to answering one question I promised you. Were there alternatives? Well, where would we look? The only place I know to look, and that I want to take you with me to look, is what happened the last time our economy went into a tailspin like this. 1929, the Great Depression. And just to remind you, the Great Depression begins October 1929, lasts over a decade. So the notion that all downturns are quick, And in case you think, well, they used to be long, now they aren't anymore, Japan entered its current depression in 1989 and is still in it. So they can last a long time. But things went very differently in the 1930s. First of all, their conditions were worse than ours. We have 8.5%, 9%. They had 25% in 1933. So much worse than we have, at least so far. So if you can imagine that there's no money for the government to do things, we have to cut back now. Imagine what it was like then. No money, and they said all that, no money, no money. And the president was elected on a Democrat, on a balanced budget program, Franklin Roosevelt. If anything, a bit more conservative than Obama. Not a lot more, but some more. And yet within 2-3 years, everything changed. Whoa, what did Roosevelt do? By 1934 and 35, I'm now going to list you some of the things that guy did. Conservative Democrat. There's no money, there's no money. Let's see. First, he created the Social Security system that many of you, I'm noticing your hair color, that many of you know real intimately and are probably grateful for. In the middle of a depression, when there's terrible unemployment and the government has no money, he announces to the American people, I'm giving every one of you that's got 65 years of age, lots of money forever until you die. Things went very differently in the 1930s. First of all, their conditions were worse than ours. We have 8.5%, 9%. They had 25% in 1933. So much worse than we have, at least so far. So if you can imagine that there's no money for the government to do things, we have to cut back now. Imagine what it was like then. No money, and they said all that, no money, no money. And the president was elected on a Democrat, on a balanced budget program, Franklin Roosevelt. If anything, a bit more conservative than Obama. Not a lot more, but some more. And yet within 2-3 years, everything changed. Whoa, what did Roosevelt do? By 1934 and 35, I'm now going to list you some of the things that guy did. Conservative Democrat. There's no money, there's no money. Let's see. First, he created the Social Security system that many of you, I'm noticing your hair color, that many of you know real intimately and are probably grateful for. In the middle of a depression, when there's terrible unemployment and the government has no money, he announces to the American people, I'm giving every one of you that's got 65 years of age, lots of money forever until you die. Whoa. But he said, I'm Santa Claus, that's just the beginning. Next, I'm going to create the unemployment compensation program. We didn't have that before, just like we never had a social security system before. In the depths of the Depression, the president says, okay, we got all these millions of people unemployed, here's money, lots of it for a long time. Have a nice day. But those were two smaller programs. Here comes the big one. He goes on the radio in 1934 and he says to the American people, see, I noticed I didn't say TV because there wasn't any. Goes on the radio and he says pretty much these words: if the private sector of the United States either cannot or will not hire the millions of Americans who need and want work, then there's no alternative but for the federal government to do it. And between 1934 and 1941, Roosevelt created and filled 12.5 million jobs. There was no money, but he found enough to pay 12 million people. Guess what? There was money. Guess what? There's money now. More than there was then, absolutely and relatively. The next time one of our great leaders in Congress gets up there and tells you how sad he or she is that there's no money, try hard not to throw a hard object at the TV. That would be the rational response, but then you'll have to buy a new TV, and you don't want to be in that situation. How did Roosevelt get it? All that money. Which, by the way, wasn't enough to get us out of the Great Depression. To get us out, he had to do one more thing, something more expensive than the Social Security and the unemployment compensation and the jobs program combined. He had to go to war. He took half of the remaining unemployed people and stuck them in a uniform, and he took the other half and put them to work making the uniform. That's how he solved it. No, that's about it. Where did Roosevelt get the money? And I want you to understand it, but I'm really speaking to that man who's going to give that speech at 9 o'clock tonight. I'm kind of hoping he maybe listens. Here's what Roosevelt did. And let's remember, as I go through it with you, that after Roosevelt did what I just told you, was he voted out of office as a man who spent at a time when the Depression did... No, he became the most popular president in the history of the country. He was re-elected president 4 times. The Republicans were so freaked out by this that immediately after the war, once Roosevelt was in his grave, they passed a law saying nobody can be president more than twice. They didn't want that to happen again. So what this man did, this enormous use of money, made sure that he became a saint for millions of Americans whose lives he transformed. And they voted him into office over and over again. For a president who's worried about an election, there's a hint here somewhere. What did Roosevelt do? Roosevelt came, as you I'm sure know, from a great American family, or to be more accurate, a rich American family. His relatives had been presidents before him, very wealthy, very well connected, all in that. So Roosevelt was in a good position to gather the richest Americans around, which he did in the White House, and the biggest heads of the biggest corporations, he gathered them around, and he gave them a talking to. And he said to them, look, I think I need to explain to you why I'm doing this, which you don't like. And before I'm done, he says, you're not going to like me even as much as you do now, which isn't much. Here's why I'm doing it. Millions and millions of American people are suffering, but of course, in and of itself, that's not a problem. Unfortunately, in the 1930s, those suffering people did something that the suffering people in America today haven't yet done. They mobilized into organizations. In the middle of the 1930s, we had the greatest labor union drives in the history of the United States. We've never had that many people join unions in a matter of months. Never before, and never since. Millions of workers joined the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. Number two, we had huge numbers of Americans join and become active in multiple different socialist parties, and also into a big, powerful, and influential communist party. Not only that, but there was lots of overlap between the CIO and the socialists and the communists. They were a real organized force. And they went to Roosevelt and they basically said, you better do something or we're going to be very angry at you, and we are very militant and we have millions of supporters. And not only will your political career be in trouble, but this whole country is on the edge of what Mr. Soros said this morning. And then Roosevelt took the next step, and he said to these corporate leaders and the rich, I want you to give me a ton of your money right now. I want you to give half, and I'm doing this simply, but I don't have the time. I want you to give me half in taxes. I'm gonna tax you till you're blue in the face. And the other half you can lend me. But you gotta give me the money, and you gotta give it right now, because I wanna take care of the mass of people. And if you don't give it to me, I'm gonna be gone, and you're gonna have to talk to those communists and socialists and union people, and they're gonna cut you a lot less good of a deal. If you give me the money, I'll take care of the mass of people. The unions, the socialists, and the communists will be satisfied with that. And they won't mess with the corporation. You'll keep your company, you'll keep in business, you'll probably do better because those people are going to have money to buy your stuff. But there really is no alternative, or else this capitalist system is over. He split them. He split the rich and the corporation. Half of them bought the argument. The other half didn't. But the half that did, together with the AFL-CIO, communists and socialists, made him the president for the next umpteen years. It worked. Just to remind those of you that are not familiar, and I do this only because American people's understanding of their own history is so poor. You know, I'm a teacher all my life. I look at your faces as I talk. I know how many of you didn't know what I just told you. I didn't make that up. Go check it out. You'll read it up, you'll see. What were the taxes that Roosevelt imposed? First one, 1944, for every dollar that the federal government raised in taxes on individuals' incomes, it raised $1.50 in taxes on corporate incomes. So taxes on corporations brought in 50% more than taxes on individuals. What's the relationship today? For every dollar that the government gets in taxes on individuals, it gets 25 cents from corporations. So on behalf of all of America's corporations, I want to say to each and every one of you, thank you. Very kind. What about rich individuals? The highest income tax Roosevelt got for people at the top, ready? 94%. That was the taxes for the richest in the middle 40s. Income tax, that's right. Personal income tax. So if you were the richest ones, made over, I think, 200,000 in those years, you paid, ready? For every dollar over 200,000, you had to give Uncle Sam 94 cents. You got to keep 6. Again, if I had more time, we would stop and I'd play the national anthem. In other words, Roosevelt said to the corporations, pay a lot, and they did. And he said to the rich, pay a lot, and they did. Because they were afraid of the alternative. So they did. By the way, those tax rates continued. What is the tax on the richest people in America today, the top tax? 35%. Down from 94 to 35. That's a tax cut. You didn't get anything like that. And don't hold your breath. Nothing like that's coming down the pike for you unless you do something. And by the way, do you know how Roosevelt got the rich to accept the 94%? That was a compromise. What Roosevelt asked for in 1942, went to the Congress and said, there has to be in the United States, I quote you, just go read your history. There has to be a maximum income in the United States. What'd that mean? He said, I want the maximum income in that year to be $25,000 a year. Now, it's in the money then. I'm going to give you in a minute. Well, I'll do it now. That's roughly $350,000 today. That's the maximum. And what does maximum mean? For every dollar over that you earn, the government taking the whole thing. You're not going to get more. That was the official proposal brought from the White House to the Congress. When the rich people saw that, they went bonkers, and they accepted a 94%, because that was 6 percentage points better than what he was offering. And why did they? Because Roosevelt kept reminding them about the unions and the communists and the socialists right down the road. So why is it that today, suffering massive unemployment, not only do we have no federal program of jobs, we have two presidents, Bush and Obama, who keep telling us that what they're doing is providing incentives and encouragements for the private sector to hire people, which they don't do. We don't even discuss it. It's not that we don't have a federal program. Neither party has lined up to propose it. The president never says a word about it. Well, it's hard to escape the following inference. Obama would like to be reelected. Watch him, you'll see that. As did Roosevelt. But Obama's not taking that route that Roosevelt took. It may have something to do with the fact of what happened at the end of World War II. When the business community, having paid these high taxes on their companies, having paid these high taxes on rich people, having put the depression behind them, and the war is now over, said to themselves, okay, that Roosevelt's now in his grave, we've got to take back what we gave away. And the next 40 years, which is, ladies and gentlemen, your lifetimes, that's what we've had. We've rolled back the New Deal. We've undone it. The taxes on corporations came down. I gave you the statistics. The taxes on the rich came down. I gave you the statistics. It's over. The right wing, the business community, the rich have been pushing and pushing, changing the laws. Give you just one example, because many of you know this. In the depths of the Depression, when the banks were failing and speculating, a law was passed called the Bank Reform Act, often with the name of the two leaders who did it, Glass-Steagall Act. And it basically said to banks, if you take deposits, you can't riskily invest them. We created two kinds of banks, a deposit-taking bank over here and an investment bank over there. If you want to make risky investments, you borrow from people who are told about that and they understand the risk, and you do. But you don't take depositors' money and do that. We created a wall between depository or commercial banks and investment banks. The banks didn't like that. Corporations didn't like those high taxes that they had agreed to pay. Corporations didn't like any of the regulations. Rich people didn't like those high taxes. So they went to work to undo what they didn't like, what hurt their profits, what hurt their income. And they worked. First, they evaded the rules and the regulations. They avoided the taxes. When they felt a little stronger, they got the laws amended, adjusted, modified. They got loopholes in them. And when they felt really confident, they just got rid of the law. Glass-Steagall, they got rid of it. In 1999, then President Bill Clinton signed the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. And 8 years later, on the nose, the banks collapsed again. You know, the first time, shame on the banks. The next time, shame on us. We permit this. The only thing worse than this is the following. There are good people, friends of mine. Well, they were, I guess. I'm not sure anymore. Who think that the response we ought to have to today's crisis is to regulate businesses better, more, like banks, to tax them more, like they once were. Friends, the last 40 years is a lesson that if you struggle really hard, if you form powerful, well-organized things like the CIO and the socialists and the communists, you may, with a long struggle, get a bunch of reforms like that. But if you don't take another step, those reforms are not secure. Those reforms are not safe. The people who have an interest in getting rid of them will do so. Now the final part. What would have had to happen in the Great Depression not to have the sorry story of a horrible crisis then, leading to a set of reforms and regulations that were then undone just in time to give us another horrible depression? What would have had to be done? We would have had to take another step. We would have had to say, look, corporations are entities whose point and purpose is to make money. They are going to look at the taxes we impose on them, the regulations we impose upon them, as so many obstacles to making money. And so they're going to use the profits they get from their business to undo the obstacles they confront. That's what they use all of their resources for. That's their job. Use your resources to create a product and then remove obstacles to profitably marketing it. So we would have had to say, okay, we understand that. Corporations and rich people have every incentive, in the way our system works, to get rid of the rules, regulations, taxes, and so on. We put them there because we were desperate to get out of a crisis that was hurting the vast majority. But we left in place an institution organized in such a way that there are people with an incentive to undo everything we've done. Now, having an incentive is nice. That's not enough. Most of you have an incentive to drive a Mercedes-Benz, but it doesn't mean much because you don't have the resources to realize the incentive. But corporations not only have the incentive, but corporations are entities that gather into their hands the resources with which to realize their incentives. How is a typical capitalist corporation organized? Just a brief reminder. The majority of people are the ones who come to work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. You know the drill. It's you. Then there is another thing called the board of directors of a corporation, 15 to 20 people who make the basic decisions: what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. And who selects the 15 to 20 people that are on the board of directors? Something called the major shareholders, another group of 10 or 20 people. Okay, let's review. The mass of the workers, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands, come to work, do the work, make the product. All the decisions are made by a tiny, teensy-weensy minority. 10 to 15 people on the board of directors and the major shareholders, who are sometimes the same people, but even if they're not. Now, those shareholders and board, they're the ones who made the decisions. They took their profits and they got rid of those taxes. And you all know how they did it. They bought the political system. They made politicians dependent on them for the campaign contribution, the parties for the party. Not in every case, there were exceptions, but in the main, that's what they did. And that was smart of them to do because they understood, we want to roll back the New Deal, we need to control politics. And if we're going to become very rich and everybody else isn't, we better control politics, otherwise the mass of people are going to try to use the political system to undo the screwing they're getting in the economic system. We got to prevent that. So they did. And we live with the results. If all we do now is put another set of regulations on them and another set of taxes, what would we be? And the answer has to be dumb. We will have learned nothing. We've just watched 40 years in which the New Deal is undone. The last chapters are being written in Washington now as they undo the Social Security system. You'll have to be older than before to become eligible. You're going to get less coverage. All of that. You know the drill. You read about it. You probably don't want to read about it, but there it is, staring you in the face. We have to take another step. We have to learn that the step not taken in the 1930s, even by socialists and communists who talked a good game, but they didn't take this step either. The step is to do what? To ask a taboo question in American life. The question is, how have we organized our production system? What is this arrangement in our enterprises in which a tiny group of people are in the position to make all the decisions and gather the wealth in their hand that will allow them to shape the society's politics, culture, and everything else? It's strange for us as Americans that we find this so normal, so necessary, so matter of fact, so commonsensical. Because we take seriously, and I would expect that especially in a room like this, we take seriously that idea of democracy, that the people who have to live with a decision have thereby the right to participate in it. But if you take seriously democracy, what happens to you every time you cross this threshold into your place of business? Thousands of workers, do they participate in the decision what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits? Not at all. You live with the result. The board of directors decides to close the factory and move it to China, you lose. Your participation in that decision? Not at all. Because the board of directors sits in Chicago and you're working in Pennsylvania, and the people in Chicago decide to use a toxic production procedure that's going to hurt your lungs, not your decision. You're free to go someplace else. Whoa. If you're interested in democracy, wouldn't it be the first place you'd put it would be in your job? For most adult people, you spend most of your life, 5 out of the 7 days of every week, on the job. You get up in the morning, brush your teeth, you get ready for work. Then you go to do work, and then you go to the happy hour to recover from the work. But your day is defined by the work. And if democracy is a value you hold dear, it belongs in the work. Otherwise, what really do you have in the way of a commitment? It's really only about voting for the mayor? Come on, you don't care that much about the mayor. You don't even know who it is. But you know about your job, and you care about that, and the decisions made around the job are the ones you probably worry about and lose sleep over. If democracy counts, why isn't it there? And if democracy existed, what would it mean? And now we're coming to the end. Democracy at the workplace. What a thought. We haven't been able to have that conversation about democracy at the workplace. We haven't been able to. We've had to deal with our capitalist arrangement. Massive people are workers, tiny group of people, board of directors and shareholders. We've had to accept that without conversation for at least the last 75 years since the Great Depression. We couldn't discuss it. If you said you didn't think this capitalist arrangement was real good, people looked at you funny. And if you kept it up, they suggested you might not be loyal. You might be ... and you didn't want to go where ... was. For the last 75 years, we've debated in America our transportation system, our education system. We just had a year of debating our health insurance system. We debate the welfare system. You get the picture. We debate those systems because they're flawed, because times change and you need to change them. We want to make them better, so we entertain criticism and we feel the need to defend against the criticism. We argue about it, and there's something healthy about facing the problems and trying to make it better, but not the capitalist economic. Couldn't do it. Too scary, too dangerous, too troubled, too something. And I think most of you know, if you have an institution that cannot be criticized, that cannot be debated, it rots. It dies. Its worst impulses become indulgible by those who make money off of them, because no one can say boo. They can shut everybody down by saying, oh, ... You better not. So the best thing that Occupy has done, in my humble opinion, is not this or that. The best thing is, they said right from the beginning, it's the economic system, and they even used the word capitalism. That's the problem. That's the first movement in 75 years with the daring and the courage to say that. And if nothing else, in the future, I'm confident, historians will look back, that was a key moment. However that was done, and then they discovered, as we did, that the American people didn't find that anywhere near so troubling as we had been taught to believe it would be. It turns out you can say it. And let me be real honest with you. I've been a critic of capitalism most of my adult life. I don't like it. It doesn't work. And that's a peculiarity of me. The three schools I attended, and I only say this to drive the point home, are Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. I'm a poster boy for American elite education. They did their level best at each of those institutions to try to make me believe and celebrate the capitalist system. Didn't work. They are disappointed. And until 3 years ago, my life consisted of being a professor, despite my anti-capitalist mentality, because in America, if you have the kind of pedigrees I do, you can do no wrong. So every time I got into trouble for my politics, I waived my degrees. People backed off. Lucky for me. But in the last 2 years, I have done more public speaking, more radio and television appearances than in the previous 40. Something has changed in America, big time, and across the country. The radio station I appear on most often is in Salt Lake City. My host begins the program, it's an hour-long interview program, at rush hour, the key time in radio to talk to people in their cars. He begins by saying his name, I'm proud to be here with you today, I'm a Republican, and I'm a Mormon. But today I want you to listen to Professor Wolff. And then for the next hour, he and I agree on everything. That's America, it's not what you thought. I can't handle the invitations I get, and I'm not alone. And it isn't me. I'm saying what I've said before. I'm saying it in the same somewhat theatrical method that I use by intention. I want to be persuasive. So it isn't me. It's the audience. The audience changed. 2 days ago, Sunday night, I went for the first time in my life to the Riverside Church on Claremont Avenue and 120th Street. Never been in it. It's a beautiful sort of European-style cathedral, a really magnificent building. And there, the minister, had invited me and a few other people to come and spend an evening talking about the same topics here. Not so much detail of economics, I was one of 5. But the other speakers were speaking in the same vein. The person who began the talk was a professor at the City University here in New York. He began. The second speaker is an old friend of mine that I'm sure you all know of, Cornel West. The third one was Serene Jones. She is the president of the Union Theological Seminary, which is right up there. And the fourth one was Rabbi Michael Lerner, who has a magazine called Tikkun, and me. And what struck me with the 300 odd folks 300 people that were there, was the extraordinary mixture of a commitment to religious feeling, to religious imagery, to religious language, and how strong they felt in a way consistent with everything I have said to you tonight. For them, their understanding of their religion was very important to them. That was brought them to this place. Took the form of feeling very intensely the need for the basic kind of change I'm ending up with here. Imagine a place with me in which enterprises worked as follows. Monday to Thursday, you come like you always did, prepared to do your job, whatever that is, and you do it. Friday, you come to work, but you do not do your particular job. All day long, you sit around in meetings with all the other workers, where you together, collectively and democratically decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. Because you are the people, you're not going to undo the Social Security program. You're not going to do away with the protections for children and folks that have no money and all the rest. You're not, because it's you. You're not going to use a toxic mechanism because you live there. It's you. And here's some other things you're not likely to do. Are you going to close the factory, move it to China? Unlikely. Are you going to pay astronomical salaries to 4 of you as against everybody else? No. And so the inequality of wealth and income in America is going to shrivel. And our jobs aren't going to disappear. And if our salaries don't shrivel and our jobs don't disappear, we won't have to borrow money like we used to. The history of our economy and of our lives would be radically different. Once upon a time, it was thought when you get to be an adolescent and you begin to be relevant for the question of children, you have to find a mate. And of course, the way to do that is to have your parents approach others their age to find the suitable partner. The idea that you would let those young people figure all that out on their own would be the end of civilization. They're too young, they don't understand, they haven't lived long enough, plus their hormones are completely out of control and they will make terrible decisions. In many parts of the world, for a long time, in some parts of the world still, that is the way. But I give you a piece of friendly advice. If you have a young child in that area, don't try that. They won't take it well. We now found out that if young people go and look for counterparts to get friendly with, the civilization doesn't fall apart, the society doesn't collapse. If the workers ran their own business, it wouldn't fall apart either. Production wouldn't stop. We wouldn't be without shoes, none of it. It's a question of breaking out of the mold, breaking out of the status quo, and realizing that the entirety of the history of this crisis, the absurd inequality that led to it, the absurd inequality of how it was handled, the suffering. None of that was necessary. But to change that, we have to have the courage to change the way we organize our businesses, to understand that the capitalist way of doing it is neither the only way nor the best way. To begin to deal with the following slogan: America can do better than capitalism.